you very much. Well, today I will be talking about how I don't know my dependencies. Before I continue, let me introduce myself. I'm Alejandro. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. If you want to talk about Messi, just come and find me after the talk in the hall. I would be very happy about it. I worked mostly on backend systems in JavaScript, and I helped run NodeConf Argentina, a conference back there, and help with other communities that are local as well. If you want to follow along the presentation, you can do that on that link, and you can find me on Twitter with that handle at the bottom. Before I continue, I wanted to share a story about this awesome person, Liren. He was talking about a blog post on dependencies and how they particularly work with lockfiles. So I reached out and to say I was interested in reviewing that blog post. So he sent the draft to me, and we started a conversation. And back then, I realized that I was using lockfiles until then, but I didn't really knew some of the key points about them. And yeah, I would say there was the spark that then became into the presentation for today. I wanted to first start with some misguided concepts about lockfiles, dependencies. Let's go over pinning dependencies. I heard that a lot of you like to pin your dependencies, which is great. I won't say it's something bad, but I wanted to display here maybe a graph, some graphical explanation of the result that you get when you pin your dependency. To be more explicit about pin your dependencies is when you put an exact number on your package.json, right? When you, instead of using the caret or a range in your dependencies, you put in a specific version, for example, 3.3 or anything that you would want. So let's say you have a happy dependency tree. You have this, on the top, you would get the package or the application that you're building now. And on the first level, you would have what it's called your direct dependencies. Your direct dependencies, again, will have other dependencies that will be your transient dependencies. Those dependencies, if you only pin your dependencies, those on the bottom that you can see on red will be resolved at install time, meaning that from one install to another, those could change, especially because in open source, it's very common to take advantage of Semver and reference a range in your libraries or in your modules. Another little known fact about dependencies is that you can cache them so that you are not dependent on the network to reinstall those. So Verdaccio is a very, very nice tool. It's very straightforward, and at the same time gives you a lot of additional features rather than cache your dependencies. You can use it as a private registry as well, in comparison to private modules provided by NPM. Another little known fact that I recently learned yesterday because a script that I was running failed is that NPM has the option to reference the file system in the dependencies, in the package.json. Who here knew about it? That you can, okay, many of you, maybe 10. I really didn't knew that and had no idea. I was like, why is this script failing? And then I realized that I didn't have the modules required to install in my file system. So if you want to do that, you can do that by putting file in your dependency column, and then the reference to the directory you want to use. I'm not sure if at this point Jeff from NPM is saying, oh no, we should delete that. I have no idea if that's a good practice or not. I just learned that, and I had to rethink a use case for that. I don't really know why anyone would do that, but the fact that you can is really cool. Awesome, thank you, Jeff. Related to log files, a lot of package managers can provide and will provide a log file for you once you install your dependencies. Both npm, yarn, or pnpm can take advantage of log files. And for npm and yarn, they are very opinionated about it. When you install npm, there's a message that is telling you that you should push that package log to your repository. Let's see what you will get when you use this type of log files. But first, let me do a show of hands. How many of you have used log files before? Okay, I would say maybe a half. That's very nice. And raise your hand if you had any problem with log files at some point. I think those are the same people. I would love to talk about your experience. Me too, I had some problems with log files back then, but I will focus on the latest versions of them. In the case of npm package log and yarn log, they are kind of different, but they provide the same functionality. Let's use the happy dependency tree that we had before. Now you can see that the dependencies that were resolved at install time before, when only pinning your dependencies, are now green because they will be logged for every install that you run, meaning that you will get reproducible builds and reproducible installs, which is super nice. And for this example, I only took a dependency tree with 2 levels, but you can imagine that working for several levels with many nested dependencies or transient dependencies in your tree. Let's see what you can get and how you can integrate these log files, how you can maintain those. Let's see how are the tools working to keep up with them. So if you use log files, maybe you've heard about this awesome tool that you have out there. It's called Greenkeeper, and a nice feature about Greenkeeper is that it's a free service for open source. You can add it to your open source modules freely, and basically it will create a new pull request for every new release on your dependencies. Then you can go and see if the test passes, and then merge those updates to your repository. A nice feature about Greenkeeper as well is that it supports semantic release, it supports mono repos, but one little catch about Greenkeeper is that I couldn't get private packages working out of the box along with log files. Another, I think, less known tool is RENOVATE, which is really nice. It's also open source. It's a free service for open source projects. And basically, it will do the same thing than Greenkeeper. It will open pull requests to your modules, and will let you know for newer versions of your dependencies. But I found a little difference to Greenkeeper, which is RENOVATE can have a very granular configuration, so that you can auto-merge your pull requests that changes on the minor version of your dependency, but not on the major, if you want to keep some difference about the new releases for that. It's also, it also provides you with the option to run self-hosted, meaning that you can run that on your own infrastructure and can integrate well with both GitHub and GitLab as well, which is really nice. Another improvement that you can use while having log files is this amazing command that basically installs your dependencies, but kind of faster. And I have an hypothesis on why this is the case. Both PNPM or Yarn doesn't offer an alternative for this. So if you're using Yarn, you will have to stick with your Yarn commands either way on CI. So npm CI, what it takes is your log file, and basically it iterates along all these lists of dependencies or dev dependencies that you have in there. Meaning that it can go over all of them without having to wait for the network to download. In the other case, if you do an npm install, basically you have to go to you have to traverse the whole dependency tree, and it will generate some blockers. For example, to get to the bottom of the tree, you will have to first download and get the package.json of the parent and the parent of that parent, and so on and so forth. So you create like a cascade on the network, and you have to add those little network requests and latency that you have going through all your tree. Where in this list, you can just choose how many you want to download at the same time and how many you want to install at the same time, which is much faster. Yesterday, I was procrastinating on Twitter, because I do that a lot. And for those who haven't heard, there was a really interesting advance and a really interesting day for science, because they presented the results for the Event Horizon telescope. They were trying to get to reproduce an image of a black hole, and they used different satellites over the Earth, and then reconstruct that those little parts as the Earth was rotating, so that they can reproduce a whole image. And I saw a reference on Twitter by someone mentioning that during the presentation they used this image that you can see here, and on the right there's a black hole that is compared to the sun, and it's also compared to the size of your modules. I'm sorry, I had to do it. The credit goes to the person on Twitter that tweeted that. I didn't thought on that. So for a case of a study, I wanted to grab the top most dependent modules, the top 1,000, and check how many of them had average dependency trees. And I realized that the average dependency tree, when you include dependencies, is 295. But when you go to production-only dependencies, meaning that you exclude the ones that you use for development, you get only 30, which is kind of nice. But then again, this is the top 1,000 most dependent modules, which are mostly libraries that you can use to build things. So I wanted to get something closer to a real-world application, something that you can build or something that you can relate to on your work. So I grabbed some prolific open source projects like RENOVATE, Greenkeeper itself, Spectrum, Keystone.js, and a couple more that we're using and we're solving a problem in the real world. So the average dependency tree size jumped to 1,052. But if you go to production-only dependencies, that goes down to 426. which is kind of nice. It's not 1,000. But then I was thinking, and we were talking about this with some other community members, what should you do about it? Like, is there something that you can do or that you would have to fix? And I don't think the correct word for it is worrying about it, but rather be conscious about the dependencies you are pulling into your application and set a level of trust in them. Say you're working on an application and you have different dependencies. I would rather check that they have like a prolific time doing open source and some level of trust for them to be responsible about it. But at the same time, you can also work on your application and write all the modules by yourself. Instead of using React or Express, you can go by your own implementation. You're not entirely forced to use any of that, but you have to wait to put on the balance that these dependencies, or the most dependencies that we see here, have contributors of the years on the number of dozens or even hundreds. They have improved performance, they have improved code quality, and so on and so forth. So you will have to think of and put a balance on those, where you want to spend your time, rather building your own version of Express, Fastify, your own version of React, or rather leveraging those tools that you can use to focus on other things. I also thought on another thing while preparing this topic was the fact that there is some thought about NPM being a proxy for our open source projects. Well, I think that's at some level could be like that, but it's not really the case if you go over the little details. For example, you can have something published in NPM that it doesn't correlate to a Git repository, or you can have a version of a module published to NPM that it's not present on GitHub. And I was thinking about it and realized why there are no tools that would check for this, that could have a validation at some point, either any of those that we mentioned today or some other tool that could check for that. So I did what every engineer does. So I built my own tool to check whether you have something on NPM that it's not on GitHub in this case. And I was going over the results for a test for this module that I built until I found one of the files for a dependency was not didn't have the exact same hash that there was on GitHub. And I was like, aha, I found you. And then I realized that there was also valid reasoning to not have the same file published to NPM that the one you have on GitHub. Say, for example, you are building your module, you are building your dependency. You could want to change what you have on that file in GitHub and what you have on NPM. So it wasn't really like a sanity check at that point. And of course, when I was almost finished with that, I realized there was another tool out there, which is nicer, I believe. The only difference that I found is that this tool receives a module name, and it can run the verification for a single module. Where on the tool that I built, you can provide your lockfile and run the verification against a list of dependencies itself. But again, there were some reasoning about whether those should be different or whether those can be different. So I don't think it's a really good alternative to verification on all those modules, but rather could be something that maintainers would use. On my results running dep verify, I found that there were some released versions on NPM that were not tagged on GitHub. So that could be run on the CI environment for that package and could be useful for maintainers to realize that they forgot to push a tag, for example. In that case, I would say something closer to what trust but verify. This it has a nicer name as well. The module on the bottom is doing, but something more configurable that you can enable or disable some checks. In the link on the top, you will find the GitHub repository for both of these tools, and you can use them and just tell me if there's something wrong on your dependencies or something broke on my package. That's all that I have. Thank you for today.